Welcome, innovators, business owners, entrepreneurs, technology experts, academia, government R&D communities, and members of the North Carolina innovation ecosystem. This is Defense Technology Talks, hosted by the North Carolina Defense Technology Transition Office, or NC DEFTECH. This podcast will showcase various technologies with local and national experts who aim to solve complex national security problems. In the coming weeks, we will highlight North Carolinians with the potential to, or those that have positively contributed to enhancing the capabilities of our warfighters, law enforcement, and first responders. We will also feature government leaders in research and development who have helped shape the future in this domain. These podcasts are just one of the many free services provided by the North Carolina government to assist the North Carolina innovation ecosystem to thrive and provide solutions to our nation.
Talks. This is your Federal Opportunities Update. I'm Rob, along with Bob Burton, my colleague here from the North Carolina Defense Technology Transition Office, or DEFTECH, and we're going to bring you some federal opportunities. We're also going to talk about what is going on in the space, because again, you have to be able to move at the pace of technology, which is a huge, huge thing. And so being able to operate at the pace of technology is very important. But without further ado, I will pass it over to Bob, and we'll get this thing started. Bob, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Rob. All right. Good morning, everyone, or good day. Glad to be back with you. We cover a lot of these topics weekly on our coffee calls. So if you've been on our coffee calls, you've heard some of these discussions. You should be aware that the next SBIR cycle is open for pre-release. You should be reviewing the topics. You should be reaching out to the topic offices, those topic sponsors, to understand where your technology and where your company fits, so that you can tweak and tune your submission. But we're jumping ahead just a little bit. We're going to cover this morning. We'll talk about a current article about how the Pentagon, how the U.S., how DoD needs to move faster to integrate advanced and modern technology, basically commercial dual-use technologies, into modern warfare. And quite frankly, the mechanisms aren't established very well. Yes, there's Defense Innovation Unit, and that's why they got a $1 billion plus up, because they are one of the only organizations rapidly integrating technology. Of course, you could look at Army Applications Lab for Army Futures Command, Office of Naval Research with their tech bridges. Nobody's doing it like DIU. And quite frankly, we're not doing it fast enough for the speed of conflict, the speed of war, and the changing geopolitical environment globally. We'll talk about the DARPAConnect that's coming up, and then we'll just highlight some of the opportunities and what this next SBIR round looks like. But this is a pretty recent article about how Silicon Valley is helping the Pentagon in the AI arms race. Again, this is focused a lot on artificial intelligence. You can see the soldier on the ground in Ukraine trying to change the tide of war against a very modern state adversary. I won't even say peer adversary, but state adversary of Russia. And they're using unconventional, asymmetric methodologies of dropping hand grenades, inside of tank cupolas, into troop formations, even foxholes and trenches. Quite frankly, commercial tech is changing the landscape of modern warfare. And Rob, as I go down and pull up some of these points, you want to highlight what some of your observations are, potentially using Ukraine, China, and what's happening around the world.
Yeah, one of the things that you have to be very, very alarmed about is the amount of state sponsorship that is going into a lot of this creativity. And I hate to say it that way, but like when you look at what was going on in the early part of the war, if you think about 2004, 2005, and the uptick in EFPs and IEDs that were coming across the border, those were Iranian influenced. And as much as we don't want to call them out, particularly for some of their nefarious activity, it has to be done. And so the same thing is happening with Russia, right? If you don't think that the Russians are being supported by the Chinese, the Iranians, and all the other nefarious actors in the world, then you're missing out. There's a lot of capabilities that the Russians don't have. They showed that when they initially pushed across the border and started the ground war. They took tremendous amount of losses. But the one thing that the Russians have been able to kind of maintain is their technological advantage to a point. And that's where the commercial industry comes in. The ability to get quadcopters over there. That's not a It's not an elaborate design, as you can see in the picture for those of you that are watching the video. If you're not watching the video, we'll leave the links in the description. But that platform is really not that specific. You know what I mean? It literally is a quadcopter that you could buy at any store with a 3D manufactured, 3D printed release on it that allows you to basically gain, I won't say air superiority, but at least it creates opportunities against the enemy at a much lower threshold. And oh, by the way, it's such a small platform that it's basically expendable. As much as we would like to say, like, look, a $2,000 or $3,000 drone is expensive, yes, but by comparison to losing an MQ-1 or an MQ-9, which is a much larger U.S. platform, not that they're using those over there in Ukraine, but by comparison, I can buy 100 small quadcopters by comparison to one like national site asset, and I can employ those on the battlefield and cause a lot of damage. And, we saw these TTPs early, in 2016 against the fight against ISIS. There was a lot of creativity that was being used to maximize commercial off-the-shelf technology to provide a technological edge. And then the sad part about it is, how do I track the supply chain? Because I know that, if it's a DJI drone, more than likely it originated in China, but that's about as far as it gets. I don't know how it got there. I don't know if it was bought in by the back market. Was it purchased on Amazon? There's so many different spider legs that can come out of that opportunity that you will spend more time and energy trying to track the source of where that piece of equipment came from to attribute it to a certain host nation. And by the time you do that, people have already been killed. So again, you have to decide, is the juice worth the squeeze? And one of the differences, as Bob mentioned earlier, the difference between the United States and, China is there's a distinct barrier between industry and government. Whereas in China, there is no distinct barrier between industry and government. The government is tasking industry with what they would like to see to get those innovations on the battlefield, to include stealing intellectual property, to include corporate and military and federal espionage against specific targets. So what you're looking at is a large-scale whole-of-government approach to fighting the U.S. government. And again, they're being able to acquire technology at the pace of technology is a very, very difficult process, because one of the most difficult parts about dealing with the U.S. government is the acquisition cycle has not changed, even though there's this desperate need to increase the amount of technology on the battlefield. But I'll pause there and pass it back to Bob. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just continue with that line of thought, Rob. And this is reading directly from the article. And this is a company talking about how we're 10 years ahead of South Silicon Valley, the startup chief executive, arguing that his company is a good example of where commercial tech is so much more advanced and more nimble than the systems being developed by the U.S. military. And then it goes on to talk about large government contracts of that scale require manufacture complex systems, and it remains a rarity. Basically, we lack the agility in the defense acquisition process, as Rob just talked about. In the article, it says this blueprint could prove crucial for the U.S. as it races to evolve its defense strategy from a reliance on heavy hardware such as tanks, ships, and aircraft to more nimble investments in disruptive systems. Quite frankly, we need both. Yes, you need a long and protracted process for major end items, your tanks, your jets, your vehicles. To a degree, there should be rapid pathways, and I know this has been a topic of discussion, rapid on-ramps for existing technologies. As Defense Acquisition University looks at this process, but we need a more agile mechanism to bring new tech, such as artificial intelligence, and its power to transform modern warfare. Back to Rob's point about China acting like Silicon Valley because of their agility. There is no bureaucracy. It's a communist nation. And there are three factors driving the shift. China's rapid development of advanced weapon systems that negate U.S. defenses. The war in Ukraine has highlighted advantages in integrating commercial tech into nation's military, and the startling advances in AI. Are we prepared for the integration of AI across our systems and in our warfighting theaters? What are your thoughts, Rob?
Yeah, one of the things about AI, it's an afterthought. It's just like electronic warfare. It's just like cyber. Everything's an afterthought. When you look at the DoD, when did they start defending the DoD against cyber attacks? If I told you, you would be surprised, but we'll say it's been less than the last 10 years. So at 2013, if they were not defending the network, you wonder why there were so many PII intrusions on the government network. And it was because they weren't defending it in a way that made sense. And a lot of the commercial capabilities, like Bob said before, is far ahead of what the military is because commercial organizations are willing to spend the dollars to protect their intellectual property. So, for example, if I bank with USAA or Bank of America or any of those other banking networks, I'm perfectly okay if they have the most sophisticated encryption on all their applications and internet connectivity. Why? Because that's protecting my money. However, from a scientific standpoint, can those tools be used better elsewhere? I don't know. But the other piece of it is even if they could be used better elsewhere, is the government willing to step aside long enough to give those people authority to operate to develop those systems on the government network? And that's one of the biggest difficulties that any SaaS company would have, whether that be an AI or ML or a computational or analytics company, is do they have the ability to operate on the government network? And most of the time it's no. And one of the afterthoughts is as well, it's like, hey, we want to have this AI product that does X, Y, and Z, which is great, but does it have authority to operate on the Department of Defense? And I can tell you, no matter how capable a platform is, if I have to do a swivel chair to put inputs into that system, it's going to be less effective. And that's, and that doesn't matter where it is and who it comes from. But one of the other pieces of it is there's a lot of bloat in the U.S. government, and that's a discussion for a much, much deeper dive. But there's so many systems where the government throws, more money at bad projects, and we can't control that. But we obviously can bring better products to the table and bring those products to bear in a way that can change some of those stovepipes of dysfunction, for lack of a better term. When you really think about it, the government is great at establishing silos of success initially, and then they fail. If you don't think that's the case, go back and look at the Comanche or the Crusader program that was in the late 90s. Like, hey, we're going to have all these automated weapon systems, and they're going to be able to do all these cool and crazy things. Well, if we would have completed those projects, now we would be on the second or third evolution of them here in 2023. But those projects got killed in the early 2000s because we dumped billions of dollars into the technology and it didn't bear fruit. And so there's always a cutoff point. There's always ebbs and flows of how the technology is applied or when the technology is applied. But at the end of the day, the government owes it to the warfighter to provide them the best capability possible. And there has to be is there a shortcut? Today, there isn't. And one of the things that, we've been talking about, and you've heard it said a couple of times, is capabilities of record versus programs of record, right? And as Bob mentioned, you have to have a program of record. So I need a main battle tank. I need, a cannon that does a certain range or whatever that is. And so those are actually programs that we have to establish and maintain. Nobody wants to roll the dice and say, hey, we're going to have a capability of record, which is force protection from a naval platform. I'm not going to get rid of the carrier strike group, right? That's not going to happen. But I need to be able to say, are there capabilities that I can add to that aren't typically in the normal production of the carrier strike group? And those are up for discussion. But again, you're fighting multiple bureaucracies to make that happen. You've got to fight the habitual people that are, on that contract, that have had it for 20, 30, 50 years and have been able to satisfy those requirements. But you also have to have those program managers that can say, hey, is there a way to do it better? Because I can assure you there are better advanced manufacturing techniques that you can make things better on a ship. But have those techniques been adopted by the Department of Defense in ship making? Have they been adopted by the Department of Defense in building tanks and bridges and weapons and all the other things that are involved in getting them on the battlefield? So that becomes a question that we all need to answer. And as a community of interest, we should be talking about these things. But I'll pause there and pass it back to Bob. Thanks.
Yeah, and just to begin with the end in mind, Steve Blank, I'm sure everyone's familiar with him as a national security innovator, lean startup methodology, hacking for defense. Well, he states in this article, for the first time ever, the U.S. military is dependent on commercial tech to win a war. They're not organized to deal with commercial tech. Now, you can also notice in the article how venture capital in weapons and defense technology startups has gone up from $16 billion in 2019 to $33 billion. It's more than doubled in only about 2 to 3 years. And that was $33 billion in 2022. Now that's from PitchBook data. Now that's one thing that we've done on the DEFTECH team is we've brought in Daniel Quinn to help explore this venture space for venture, corporate, angel capital? How do we get our companies the necessary revenue or dollars or investment so that they don't perish or die in the valley of death? Why? But continuing on in the article, beginning at the Defense Department to reallocate some of its mammoth $886 billion budget from its 5 incumbent prime contractors, which include Lockheed Martin and Boeing. I'm reading from the article, folks. To the thousands of entrepreneurs producing cutting-edge systems remains an obstacle. Tech entrepreneurs and investors have accused military leaders of engaging in innovation theater, paying lip service to the benefits of disruptive technology while holding back lucrative contracts. I'm not going to comment on the truth validity of this process, of this system. However, again, I'll go back to what Steve Blank stated. For the first time ever, U.S. military is dependent on commercial tech to win a war, but we're not organized to deal with that commercial tech. Your DEFTECH team is remaining agile in updating our strategy as we go, not waiting 10, 12, 20 years to update our strategy. Strategy must be reflected daily, weekly, and in some cases hourly, especially because the changes of technology, the speed of acquisition of those commercial technologies and integration and transition into warfighting capabilities, not just in our own forces, but looking at what the adversary's doing. And we've got to maintain pace or outpace adversarial integration of this tech, such as AI. But right now we're not organized to deal with the commercial tech. So that's why DEFTECH is here. That's why we offer the TIDE program for doing technology scouting. That's why we do the coffee calls. We do these technology discussions, DEFTECH Live, to do ops updates. So now let's go ahead and just shift gears just a little bit. I'd love to hang on that last conversation, but maybe join us back on this week's coffee call on Friday, and maybe we'll deep dive a little bit more and would love to hear some of your input. But here's how DARPA is getting after and looking for the next leap ahead exponential capability from our formations, from the startups, from the academic space and the universities and the labs, from the professors, and integrating those with their particular programs. You're going to hear from the small. This isn't a DARPAConnect necessarily deep dive. We'll have a DARPAConnect discussion here shortly. But just want to highlight that you've got about 2 weeks left to sign up for this. It's at UNC Greensboro in Greensboro, North Carolina on September 19th. Registration ends on the 12th. But I'll just read these offices real quick, and then I'll ask Rob to kind of comment on some of the topical conversations and why folks should show up. You're going to hear from Ms. Jennifer Thabit from the Small Business Programs Office. You're going to hear from Dr. Carrie Dugan from the Biologic Technologies Office. Dr. Rodith, I can't read all the names, from the Defense Sciences Office. Benjamin Griffin, Microsystems Technology Office, or MTO. Most of these offices have open broad agency announcements that you should be aligning your technology, your company, and your approach with these DARPA requirements. Dr. Allison O'Brien, Information Innovation Officer, ITO. Mr. Mark Jones, Contract Specialist. And Dr. Alex Place, Innovation Fellow at DARPA. So just a few offices. You can see why you should be at this event here coming up in just under a month, but you've got 2 weeks to register. You want to highlight some of these topical areas, Rob, and what people can gain from attending?
Yeah, so when you're looking at these opportunities, the first part of it is who is DARPA? If you don't know who DARPA is, like for those of you that remember, it wasn't Al Gore, it was DARPA that actually invented the internet. So that's your first step. A little bit of history for you. However, the reality of it is they are constantly looking for the next breakthrough in innovation. So they're going to be looking at understanding how DARPA does announcements and contract vehicles, because a contract vehicle is important, because if you can't get on the contract vehicle, the opportunity for you to actually monetize your technology is there. You know, one of the other part of it is engaging the program managers. Who are they? What are they specifically looking for? There's a group of people that is out there looking to satisfy your requirements or help you satisfy their requirements so you can have the opportunity to win money and move forward. Interpreting and shredding DARPA solicitation. Shredding. That is a very pointed word. And the reason why it's pointed that way is because sometimes you can't get things through a cursory glance. So you have to dive deeper into the technology or into the opportunity. So it's not just reading it. It's not just interpreting. It's getting down to the nuts and bolts so you can write your proposal so it is right sized and it fits absolutely. I'm going to skip down to the bottom of it and talk about strategies for winning a DARPA proposal. That's the last thing. And then there's the Heilmeyer catechism. And that is one of the most important things. And that's really like what DARPA was based on, is how do we make these happen? And I know Bob is much more fluent in the Heilmeyer catechism. So if I'll pass it back over to you to kind of elaborate on that so people can really understand the point of the DARPAConnect and what is the Heilmeyer catechism, so people understand, what they're looking for and how those interactions are actually built based off of this principle.
Yeah, I'm actually not going to deep dive that because DARPA is going to come on here in a couple of weeks. We'll do a podcast with them. They're going to be on a coffee call. The main thing to know about the Heilmeyer catechism is it's the language that DARPA speaks. If you're going to work with a government agency, you have to speak their language. You can find more information on their website about their different. I'd love to deep dive this, but we're going to keep moving. But again, sign up for our mobilized community. I did a deep dive on the Heilmeyer catechism, you showing examples, and we'll cover it this Friday on the coffee call about how you can communicate with the language and speak DARPA speak. Because it's absolutely critical that you speak the language of your end user. So again, you can go through and see the types of technologies, these different offices. Not all of them have open broad agency announcements, but many of them do. And those are associated with their priorities as charged by the DARPA director. So again, would love to deep dive that more. But let's dig in just a little bit into the broad agency announcements and the current SBIR cycle that's upon us. The pre-release launched last week on August 23rd. Right now is your time to get in and start looking at these 89 topics for the annual BAA and the 21 topics for DoD SBIR 2023.4. Remember, these happen. Everything in the government happens in cycles. As we rapidly approach the end of the fiscal year, right now all dollars have been allocated and they're programmed and they're trying to execute now before the end of September. Why? Because the clock rolls back to zero, the budget rolls back to zero, and the new fiscal year begins. So right now, again, contracts are being let or built for the next funding cycle fiscal year based on the president's budget request to Congress, the release and priorities in the NDAA, and all that. And again, if you've been around DEFTECH for a day or two, you've already heard us deep dive those. So you can go back and find those episodes or join us on the coffee call. But let's dig in just a little bit to the amendment for DoD SBIR 23.4. This is amendment number 2. What I thought was really interesting, I just want to highlight a couple of these points, is that you have to do your due diligence. This was just added. If you haven't read these broad agency announcements, then all you got to do is click on this BAA instructions, this one, and this one, and it will download the PDF. All I did was drop it in the browser for this presentation. Looking at security risks, you have cyber requirements that you have to meet, or you will not even be considered. So if you're not reading these broad agency announcements, these BAAs, and these amendments, you're going to miss something. Disclosures regarding ties to the People's Republic of China and other foreign countries. That's why we kind of did that deep dive up front to disclose who our adversary is. Number one adversary threat, pacing threat, is China. The acute threat is and remains Russia. And of course, there's numerous asymmetric threats to include Iran, North Korea, and others. But the world is changing, folks, and if we don't change and catch up with it, you see what's happening with the BRICS nations. Saudi Arabia has just been brought in, and numerous other agents. I think even Iran, if I'm not mistaken. Rob, you want to talk about some of the changing geopolitical environment and how that impacts potential conflict in modern warfare?
Yeah, the closer that the ties are happening, if you're not watching, the Chinese are everywhere. And Chinese are grabbing land, they're purchasing mines, they're doing lots of different agreements all throughout the world. And all those things are doing what we used to do as a military, both as a government and as a military force. They're establishing power projection locations all over the country. So if I can get an airstrip in Cuba, as the Chinese can do, and they have a relationship there, guess what they can do? That provides them overflight that allows them to have striking distance on the continental U.S. in minutes rather than hours. Rather than flying transatlantic, they're coming out of the Caribbean. And so those are things that you have to consider as part of the whole geopolitical scape. It's not just technology. Technology is only a small piece of everything else that is going on out there. Like, there's land agreements, there's purchase agreements, they're purchasing they're purchasing rare metals, and those rare metals are going to be used in how do we develop our next generation fighter, our electric batteries, all the things that potentially could impact the government, not only the government, but the commercial space as well. They're buying up these assets to put you in a financial position, to put the U.S. in a financial position where we'll be relying on China. Now, that could be good in a way and that's bad in a way. It's good in a way because, again, if both countries realize, hey, there's mutually assured destruction and going to war with each other, we're going to lose X number of assets. They'll lose so many assets. It may prevent war. However, given the last couple of years, you've seen a step up in Chinese aggression. And so that's probably the financial ties are not outweighing the military aggressiveness. And so you have to balance those two things. And one of the things that we can do to balance that is to build as many capabilities as possible that can counter the Chinese government and put us in a position of, authority and overmatch. And we have not had that in a few years. And the reason why it hasn't happened partially is because of the government. The other part of it is that there are no dollars flowing from the government into these innovative solutions that commercial companies already have. Hey, if the Army, if the military needs a flying car, I guarantee you that there's probably somebody building one on the outside. We have Agility Prime, which is a program through AFWorks, but do the outcomes for Agility Prime match the same ones as a commercial organization? Maybe not. And that commercial organization be like, yeah, that's cool, but I want to go make, $300 billion rather than making $10 billion working for the U.S. government. And so that's where we have to strike the balance. However, if you're an innovator and you have an idea that can work in both spaces, that's why we consistently talk about dual purpose technology over and over and over again. Every time we talk to companies, it's not just what is your technology, what dual purpose does it have? How does it support the warfighter? How does it support someone else? And again, that's just something that you have to think about. And there's so many different facets of getting your information in front of the government. But again, one of the biggest things, as Bob mentioned, is do you have any ties to foreign countries, whether that be China or anybody else? Because the Berry Amendment is still in the forefront of everybody's mind as far as acquisition is concerned. And then you layer on all the cyber hardening requirements that are needed to be successful. And it's a long runway for a small business to get into the government space. Not impossible, but if you start today, you'll have fewer roadblocks in front of you than you did yesterday. Thanks.
Yeah, so if you haven't read these broad agency announcements, the landscape is rapidly changing. As Rob talked about, what are your ties to foreign militaries, foreign countries? Not necessarily militaries, but if you look, you have ties to China, you have ties to their military. They are one. It's a communist regime. I think this is pretty interesting. Majority ownership in part by multiple venture capital, hedge fund, and private equity firms. They want to know that. They want to look at, because you're going to, so to speak, be not allowed to be competitive in this space because you haven't fully understood what these conflicts of interest are. So you've got to go through and read this and really shred, like Rob talked about, shred each one of these broad agency announcements before you submit, or you're not going to be able to submit for it. Of course, if you look at public law, last year was passed the SBIR and STIR Extension Act. They threw in there extensively. If you just go in here and just search the word China, it's going to pull up multiple times. So the landscape is changing. We have to change with it. We want our companies to submit. You should submit to these opportunities that are out there. So again, we'll just do a real quick breeze through these because we'll drop the links in the podcast description. Join us on the coffee call, but we'll start to wrap up this discussion. We started big picture. Now we're down into the topic areas with the X-Tech Pacific Open Topic Competition. Again, opening up in September and closing really 2 weeks later. Low-cost SWIR laser sensors. This one is open. Again, this is the annual BAA. This is open right now, August 24th, and it closes. You've got to pay attention to these dates. Look at the requirements in the broad agency announcement. And we want you to submit for each one of these topics. Again, there's 89 topics for the active annual BAA 2023.3, 9 topics for that same STIR.Charlie, and then there's 3 topics for this current STTR or technology transfer, and then 21 topics available for this current cycle, again, which pre-release And these annual are going to run throughout the entire year, through this calendar year. I don't even think they stop at the fiscal year. They run to the end of the calendar year. So the dollars are potentially allocated coming up in October, or you may have to wait till the next funding cycle. But anyways, this is how the government is getting after these technologies, whether it's DARPA fighting the war after the next, or whether it's the services getting after their modernization priorities. This is Army, X-Tech Prime, X-Tech Cyber Autonomy, all these things. Those are all tied to their modernization priorities. So we'll kind of wrap it up there. But the importance is reading these broad agency announcements, finding the department or agency that you want to do business with, and then learning how they speak, how they communicate, what their requirements are, what their priorities are, what their modernization strategy is, what their acquisition strategy is. And they lay all of this out there. Set up a call with your DEFTECH team. We'll help you navigate this process. So final thoughts, Rob, and we'll wrap up this week's session.
Yeah, just keep in mind, like, we've thrown a lot at you, and we throw a lot at you every time we do one of these. And that's because there's a lot of information out there. And so the best thing that you can do is, take it in bite-sized chunks. Contact us if you have specific questions. There's lots of opportunities across the Department of Defense and, well, all federal agencies, right? When you look at what's on the slide, you got Department of Navy, Air Force, CBRN, Defense Health Agency, Logistics Agency, OSD, and you have the Geospatial Office of the Secretary of Defense. There's a lot of information that's out there. The first part of it is when you look at an opportunity, does it fit? If you think it fits, dive a little bit deeper. And then if you get to the point where it's like, yeah, I think I can do this, that's when you want to shred this thing and tear it apart. If you need help doing that, reach out to your DEFTECH team. We can help you mine through all these requirements and help you find that. We are not against helping founders, and that's part of our charge. And it's your tax dollars at work. So yeah, we can sit and search opportunities all day, or we can help coach companies to success. But either way, we're doing our job. So if you want to reach out to us and get some additional assistance or get an extra set of eyes on a proposal that you're writing, let us know. We have templates to help you get through that. If you're not talking to your DEFTECH team, you're missing out on a great opportunity for some low-cost support. And when I say low-cost, I mean free. But for Bob Burton and the rest of the DEFTECH team, I'm Rob Robinson. This has been your Federal Opportunities Update for this week, and we will see you guys next time. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Defense Technology Talks, hosted by the North Carolina Defense Technology Transition Office, or DEFTECH. The views expressed in this broadcast are solely those of the individual contributors. As indicated, DEFTECH does not take responsibility for those statements or opinions and accepts no responsibility or liability for any inaccuracy or omissions reported during this program. The content and interviews are fair use for instructional purposes and to build awareness for the North Carolina innovation ecosystem. The full version of this presentation has been uploaded to our Mobilize platform. Mobilize is just another free service provided to you to access more national security and business collaboration opportunities. You can sign up for more information at deftech.nc.gov. Join us soon for the next podcast coming to a platform near you. DEFTECH is a subsidiary of the North Carolina Military Business Center and receives its support from Fayetteville Technical Community College.